Despite the fact that the government was able to propose and ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, positive change really was slow for African Americans following the Civil War. There were mechanisms often put in place by Southern state governments to sort of bypass some of the legal gains that had been won by African Americans during this time period. Kind of muting the influence of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was the idea of sharecropping. This is like an arrangement between somebody that owns the land and someone that is basically rented the land. So, following the conclusion of the Civil War, after the abolishment of slavery, it was difficult for many African Americans that had been enslaved to provide for themselves. Economic opportunities were relatively limited. So one of the things that often happened was that African Americans would basically either with a former plantation owner that had enslaved them or with another plantation owner would agree to work on the land and like rent it, like purchase a small piece of land, but without money, they had to basically work off their debts. And Southern plantation owners would charge African Americans a significant amount of their crop for the rent for the land, for the tools they were given, and other supplies. And essentially, what happened was that Southern plantation owners were able to keep an almost forced labor supply, not slavery, but by calling it different like names, like sharecropping. You're still essentially having people work on the land for you. You're taking a significant portion of their crop in the form of like rent. So this was prevalent in the years following the Civil War. Also, the idea of de jure segregation. This is something that became prevalent after the Civil War. This is segregation that is legally enforceable. Like there are local laws or state laws that establish this, and if you violate the ordinances or the laws, you could be prosecuted. These were initially established by Jim Crow laws, which was the nickname for the laws that initially established segregation in the South in the 1800s. And it was actually sort of legalized by the Supreme Court in one of the more controversial decisions ever made by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, which gave legal backing to the principle of like separate but equal, that you could keep African Americans and whites separate as long as that didn't come at the expense of equality. But we know how American history played out. It was easy to enforce the segregation. There was very little effort put into ensuring that there was equality and access to resources. And this is just a quick video that sort of highlights a little bit of the segregation that existed in places like Birmingham, Alabama.
I was 10 when we moved to Birmingham, Alabama. My dad was sent there to build a church. When you move a lot as a child, you're the new family on the block. Our community was not well kept. There was litter on the streets. It was hot, and it takes a while to adjust to that. And then we had to get used to seeing all these signs. I began to see, well, wait a minute, what is this? What is this craziness? I rebelled. When we would get on the bus, they would have these little signs that you had to sit behind, colored and white, but you could move them. So I would move mine as far to the front as possible. You could go to an ice cream store. On one side, you had places to sit and eat your ice cream. On the other side, you had to either stand or buy it and leave. Of course, I went to the other side, and I was sent back. I just had to do that. I just felt like, you know what, this is wrong. Wherever I felt like I could take a sip from the white fountain, I would.
So again, that just provides a little glimpse into one person's experiences with this legalized segregation that's prevalent throughout the southern United States during this time period. And then another prevalent thing that occurred in many southern states were really attempts to discriminate against African American voters and reduce the significance of the 15th Amendment. So many African Americans were forced to take literacy tests. These differed from state to state, but some states required you to be able to read a passage prior to being able to vote. You had to demonstrate that you were literate. And other states would require you to actually take some sort of like historical government-based test. And your ability to vote was tied to your ability to pass the test. Um, Poll taxes. This is, as you can see the sign on the screen, requiring people to vote, pay, excuse me, in order to vote. That there'd be a financial tie to like voting. And then I'm going to skip down to the next one, like voting vouchers were prevalent too. In many communities, in order to vote, you had to find someone that was willing to vouch or support you, back you up, say that you would be a good voter if you wanted to vote. So if you wanted to register to vote, you would have to find someone that was already registered to be able to vouch for you. In many communities across the South, where you only had white registered voters, it was going to be almost impossible for African Americans to find someone to vouch for them. And then ideas like the literacy test, the poll tax, oftentimes would, the way that Southern governments would justify them is saying that, like, oh, well, it's not just targeting African Americans, like everybody would be impacted by the literacy test, the poll taxes. But then sort of like the one that allowed most whites to be exempted from them was the idea that you would have to take a literacy test unless you could prove that your grandfather was a registered voter, or you'd have to pay a poll tax unless you could prove that your grandfather was a registered voter. This would allow most white Americans to be able to opt out of these Southern laws, and again, be very difficult for African Americans at this time to be able to opt out by saying that, well, I don't have to take a literacy test or pay the poll tax because my grandfather was an eligible voter. So again, change was very slow to come for African Americans during this time period. The 13th through 15th Amendments were really significant, but Southern states also put many mechanisms in place to try and limit their significance.